You say schools use a sleight of hand when they're teaching evolution. What do you mean by that?
So a sleight of hand is normally like in a card trick where something's presented and then when you're looking the other way, something else is brought in sneakily. So what I mean in a classroom setting is that when we teach the theory of evolution, what's actually being taught in the classroom is natural selection. And so they teach natural selection, natural selection, natural selection week after week. And at the end comes the sleight of hand to say, and this is the theory of evolution. Now you can see how it works.
My kids could be learning this sleight of hand. What can I do as a parent?
That is of concern. And I think the number one thing a parent should do is actually...
Evolution is widely taught around the world as a foundational pillar of biology. The examples given would make students feel like it's been proven right before their eyes. But I have a guest here today who would say that a sleight of hand has taken place and that most students and even teachers don't know that it's happening. Julie, you have honours research in ecology. You've managed research stations and you've now been working for 15 years managing a school science laboratory. You say that a sleight of hand has taken place. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, thanks, Jess. So by sleight of hand, normally when we use that phrase, we're talking about maybe a card trick where someone presents one card but with some dexterity and maybe some sneakiness, throws in a card at the last minute for their advantage. So when I talk about that in a classroom setting in regards to teaching evolution, what I mean is that a student will enter our biology classroom and be told, this unit we're going to learn all about evolution. But from that time forward, all the teacher will teach is everything about natural selection. So they'll cover the theory side, they'll do pracs, and everything will be natural selection, natural selection, natural selection. And then right at the end, they'll say, and now we've learned all about evolution. And this is the sleight of hand, is that students are actually learning about natural selection. But what they're being told at the end is that you've just been taught everything you need to know about evolution.
Okay, there's something going on here. I think we should unpack this. Can you maybe start by telling us then what is actually being taught in terms of evolution in the classroom?
Yep, so it'll probably cover about a term's worth of work in a high school. So the teacher will have to start off with the basics. So they'll normally start with genetics and getting that idea about genetic traits are inherited. You know, we get traits from our mum, we get traits from our dad, and that's why we have variation in a population. And so once they've sort of got that nailed about genetics, we get things inherited. Not all individuals look the same. Some people have different traits than others. And they'll proceed with this idea of natural selection that, you know, in an environment, organisms with different traits may outperform other organisms. So therefore, they'll have a reproductive advantage. That will cause those traits to be passed on to future generations.
Okay.
And through this process, you'll have natural selection occurring, that you'll have a change in a population.
And students would probably understand that. They could observe that or they know that's happening. You know, we've heard about that before. Okay, get it.
Yeah, this is something that everyday people see and say in their everyday lives. So once they've established this idea of natural selection, that's the theory side of it covered. They'll then do some hands-on practicals. So as an example, the teacher might do a demonstration for them. So they might pull out, say, some coloured counters and they'll have some that are blue and some that are yellow. And they'll say, imagine these counters are beetles and they all live on a sand dune. And just like humans have different eye colours, these beetles just have different shell colours. Some are blue and some are yellow. And so they're all getting along in their merry little lives. But because they're on a sand dune, the blue beetles get predated more than the yellow beetles because obviously birds...
Right.
Yep. So birds can obviously see those blue beetles a lot easier. The yellow ones can camouflage in a sand dune. So over time, blue beetles get eaten more. The trait for that blue colour, which they've already discussed is genetics, can be inherited. That isn't passed on to their offspring. So over time, that population will change and they'll all be yellow beetles. And the teacher will say, look, the population has changed. Change occurs.
Okay. And the students go, yep, I can see how that would happen.
Yep. And so that's sort of the theory side. And then normally to make kids get engaged in the topic, they'll do what we call a practical. And this is something that the students get to do a actual hands-on activity by themselves. So one of the examples that I've seen in classes used, and is a popular one, is something that mimics sort of Darwin's finches, they say. So they will say, we're going to do an investigation to look at, what if we had a population of birds living on an island and these birds had different beak types. And we're going to investigate and do an experiment to see, are these different beak types an advantage to these birds? Now, obviously, in a school science lab, we can't get birds with different beaks. So they'll pull out some like plastic forks, plastic knives, a toothpick, and a spoon. And so they'll say they'll get kids in a group of 4 and say, each of you are going to pretend to be a bird and these are your different beak types. And so they'll get around a table and say, okay, we've got some food source here and it's a nice soft fruit. So we might use sultanas. And the teacher will say, okay, in the next 10 seconds, all of you are going to be competing for this same resource, these nice, fresh, soft sultanas.
Yeah, okay.
And in the next 10 seconds, you have to see who can harvest the most food. And obviously, student with a spoon beak is going to do a little bit better than a student that has a knife beak.
Okay.
But they'll run it as an experiment. They'll record data.
Okay.
They'll do multiple trials. And then at the end of that, the teacher will say, okay, we're now going to introduce an environmental pressure. There's been a drought on the island and we don't anymore have sultanas. We're going to get rid of all the sultanas and we'll bring out some hard beans. There's a drought. We only have seeds now available for the birds. So we're going to repeat this and see if a change in food source alters our bird population. So again, the students will do the same thing, 10 seconds, try to collect as much seeds now as possible.
Okay.
And they'll collect all their data, they'll do their averages, and the teacher will then run through the results of that experiment and say, what did you notice with a change in food source?
Okay. And what did the students come up with?
Well, of course, all the kids that had the poor toothpick, which were doing really well at the beginning, now have starved to death. And they say, well, their birds all died off because they couldn't get any food.
Okay.
And so the students can then actually see with their own eyes, they've done a prac hands-on and seen, well, hang on, we went from a population of birds that had all this variety and now we're only left with, birds that have like a spoon beak or a fork beak. There's been change in a population and we've actually seen it. And one of the questions that is asked in one of those pracs is, given that you've seen a change in this population, what is this process called?
Okay.
And the answer the teacher is looking for there is evolution.
Right.
But what the students have actually done has done a great experiment in natural selection.
Before we continue, a quick heads up. Stick around until the end of the interview because we'll be giving away a free stream of our award-winning documentary, Evolution's Achilles Heels. You won't want to miss it. Now, back to the interview. Okay, so they've done something practical to engage them and to help them understand the process of natural selection, but they've then been told they've seen evolution before their eyes.
And that's why I use the phrase sleight of hand.
This is interesting because when you think about students learning science in a classroom, you would hope that they are learning facts, particularly if we're talking about the scientific method. You would hope they're learning correct definitions, that they're not being told something is potentially proof of something else. I want to unpack this more. So we've looked at, how they're presented with theory. They're then given a practical to help them understand a little bit more. It sounds like it's quite persuasive along the lines of this is them seeing evolution. Do you feel that that's the case as you watch this happening, and is there a problem with that?
Yes, there is a problem because, the students are getting taught the science of natural selection really well. But the problem lies in that students believe they're learning about the process or the theory of evolution. And so what happens is that they do the theory and the practical content of learning about natural selection over and over again
Right, not just once, might actually happen a few times. Okay.
Yes. This is just one example of one prac.
Right.
They're going to study this unit for a whole term. But the problem lies in students walking away from a classroom believing that they have just been taught about evolution when all they've learnt about is natural selection. And so they walk out of the classroom saying, well, I actually saw change happen. I saw it in an experiment. And when I think about real life examples, I can think about, different types of chickens that are bred and all different dog breeds. I can see this idea of natural selection that I did as a prac in the classroom. I can see real world examples. So therefore, with some imagination and long periods of time, they walk away thinking evolution is plausible.
Because the other part of evolution is teaching them long periods of time, is correct. So with all that in the mix together, it sounds like they will be feeling like this is very convincing. This is correct.
Yeah, well, because they've actually done an experiment. And so, students learn in science that this is how you do science. You do experiments. They, like I said, with that experiment, they collect data, they analyze the data. It does feel very scientific because that part of it is, and it is done really well. But the sleight of hand at the end is then switching that word natural selection and slipping in evolution. And those two things are not the same.
So maybe we need to highlight this, the difference between evolution and natural selection. Take us through it.
Okay. So the theory of evolution states that all life on Earth arose from a common ancestor. And it is through the process of natural selection and mutations that explains the diversity of life that we have.
Okay. One common ancestor, then natural selection and mutations. Okay.
Yeah. Whereas natural selection is a process where individuals within a community will all have different traits. Those traits are inheritable. So some of those traits mean individuals are able to have a reproductive advantage. So that means basically they're able to survive and reproduce more than others. So therefore those traits are going to be passed on more than other traits. So we're going to see a gradual change within an organism because of natural selection. Mutations is where the DNA in a genome is changed. So that can be through multiple ways. We can have deletion of information. We can have the addition of information by copying errors. And we can just have a DNA swap going on with a copying error. So natural selection, different traits are passed on, which can change a population over time.
Like the Beetles we talked about?
Like the Beetles. So they already have those traits in the genome. It's just sorting out which ones are going to be expressed. Mutations can actually change what is actually in the genome. It can add information, it can delete it. But it's those two processes working together that make the theory of evolution work according to the theory.
Okay. Significant differences. I think this is really important. So would some people say, so natural selection is a part of evolution, so doesn't that kind of prove evolution?
Yeah, that's an interesting claim. So we can pick that one apart quite easily because as I've said earlier, natural selection is something that happens. Everyone can see it.
Yep.
Kids can do experiments in class and prove it. But natural selection as a process doesn't actually help the theory of evolution. Okay. And I'll explain why.
Yep.
So as I used the examples before, like with the beetles and with the birds. So if we take those two ones, those beetles actually lost genetic information from their genome. They lost the blue trait. Because all those blue beetles died out. So we only have that yellow trait left. So there's actually a loss of information in the genome. If we think about the birds that we looked at with the different beak types, the birds that had like maybe that toothpick beak would have died out when the environment changed. So we actually had a loss of information from the genome. Evolution requires a gain of information for it to work. Right. So because the theory of evolution states that life arose from a single-celled common ancestor, so we've gone from a microbe, which has, if we look at just the genetic code, which is all of the information about how we're built, what we look like, how we run, all of that information in a single-celled organism would be hundreds of pages long.
Wow.
The genome in a human being is thousands of books of information.
Okay.
So if we're going to go from a single cell to a human being, that is a vast amount of information that has to be added to the genome. Natural selection works in the opposite direction of where evolution needs to go. Natural selection, at best, will maintain the amount of genetic information, but all the examples that we see, it actually loses information from the genome.
So natural selection doesn't sound like it's a very strong support of evolution, and yet what you're telling us is they are teaching us that it's one of the mechanisms that makes evolution happen.
Yes, the only way you can actually get that extra information that's required is through mutations, which is a part of the theory of evolution, but it's not something that's taught in high school. They leave it out altogether. So in an Australian context, the Year 10 understanding statement for science in the Australian curriculum is the theory of evolution by natural selection explains the diversity of life.
No mention of mutation.
They don't even mention mutations. And they do that because it's such a complicated topic to teach, but also all the examples that we do have from science about mutations is that they actually don't gain function.
So it's just starting to seem like how is, if the definition is just that it's via natural selection, but that process is going in the wrong direction, how is it being taught over and over again that that is the mechanism that makes evolution work?
Again, it's that sleight of hand. And you do have a process in a classroom where you have a teacher teaching from a textbook or from a source material, and you have students who are interested in science teaching. And if a teacher is teaching this saying, they are teaching it truthfully in terms of teaching natural selection, but there's that misunderstanding of those two words.
I feel like saying to them, call it natural selection, don't call it evolution.
Yes, yeah. They're doing a great job at teaching natural selection. It's the sleight of hand at the end that says this is evolution. That's the frustrating part because it's not. You're not teaching evolution. There's no explanation as to how organisms gain information. We're only teaching that there's actually a loss of information. And it's interesting because we talked through those definitions. If we take the definition of evolution that it needs to be a gain of information, and we've just talked about natural selection, that it's actually a loss of information. So if we take that syllabus statement of, the theory of evolution, which is the gain of information, is explained by natural selection, the loss of information, and that explains the diversity of life. It doesn't make any sense.
All right, so if we look a little bit more at mutations, you've said that students are not really being taught about mutations. What are they being told anything? And if so, what is it?
So in junior high school, I would say no. Obviously, anywhere like a senior syllabus goes into more detail, but just looking generally speaking at that sort of middle school, lower high school, it's not in any of the science understanding topics, the actual word mutations. Right. I do remember trialling a prac once where we tried to introduce the idea of mutations, and mutations are actually random. They're not directed. An organism can't choose to have a certain part of its genome deleted or extra information inserted.
Right, it's completely random.
Mutations are random. So we tried to do a prac to show randomness of mutations, and you'll have to try to visualize this with me. So we like birds apparently in science classrooms. So we did birds, and if we changed, mutations on where their wings are positioned, their wing length. So we did that by making these paper birds. Okay. So just, straws and strips of paper. Yep. And we designed one that actually flew really well. And so that was our standard point. So we knew that it could fly. So then the prac was introduced to the students with dice. So, roll the die, and if you get, these numbers, you have to move the wing point on the piece of straw a centimetre to the left. And if you roll a number on this die, you have to reduce the size. So it was all just randomness in like what was going to be changed.
So accurately representing what mutations would kind of do.
Yes, exactly. And then so the the criteria was that the bird had to fly a certain distance to say that it would be able to survive in the wild, because that's always sort of the clincher in terms of, mutations and natural selection is something can change, but whether it's beneficial to that organism is a completely different matter. So unless it can survive to be able to reproduce, those traits won't be passed on. So we had sort of a distance this thing had to fly to say it could be passed on. What we found, but the prac failed spectacularly, because we soon discovered that with random changes, all the birds died, because we designed the bird obviously to be able to fly to start with. But as soon as we started changing that randomly, and by random amounts and random numbers, the data that came back at the end of the class was like, well, all the birds died. So if you changed anything, it didn't work. And so we quickly removed that from our repertoire of pracs and decided to delete that entirely, because it actually, it worked beautifully from a science point of view to show that mutations pretty much are detrimental to an organism. They're
so
very
why would we keep this experiment in here? It seems like it's actually represented very accurately what happens.
Yes, but it doesn't help the evolution storyline.
Okay.
Because it just introduced so much confusion to students to say, well, hang on, I can now see this happening with my own eyes and it doesn't work. So therefore, that's not helping to prove evolution. So it got waylaid. And we stuck just to natural selection because that's much better.
Even though, again, we've still got natural selection being a process that is not gaining information and going in the wrong direction. Wow. Okay. These classrooms are interesting contexts for this stuff. I'd also like to ask, from your opinion and your experience, if someone were to ask you, what would you say should be taught in these classrooms? Should we teach evolution?
I would say absolutely yes. We should teach the theory of evolution, because it is the current paradigm that scientists use to explain life in a materialistic way.
Right.
And so for anyone who's looking to pursue a science career, you need to understand what the current science paradigm is. So I think absolutely schools should be teaching evolution, but I think they should be teaching evolution. I think they should be teaching the theory of evolution, not just natural selection, and then saying that that is evolution. I think it needs to be taught honestly. And what that means is saying this is the theory, these are the claims it makes, these are the processes that it says it uses to explain the diversity of life. But then they actually have to be honest to say, well, these are actually some of the faults. These are some of the things that we just don't know. These are some of the things we just take on, dare I say it, faith. It's that leap of, we're just going to presume this happens. So I think absolutely schools should teach the theory of evolution, but they should be doing it in an honest manner.
I hope you're enjoying this interview so far. Creating content like this takes a considerable amount of time, effort, and resources. We're passionate about getting this message out, and we want to keep bringing you more videos like this one. But here's the thing, we need your help to make this happen. Your support, no matter how big or small, will help us cover our production costs and enable us to continue creating impactful content. To support this project, just use the link in the description below or the on-screen prompt. We're so thankful for your support. Okay, so if we know it's good that we should be learning about the theory of evolution, natural selection, mutations in the classroom, but as a parent, my kids could be learning this sleight of hand and not knowing they're being taught natural selection, but it's being called evolution. What can I do as a parent?
Yeah, that's something that is of concern. And I think the number one thing a parent should do is actually learn what is going on in their child's classroom, because it's going to be specific to them. See, the problem we have is that when kids have different physics teachers, they're all going to walk out of those different classes all learning the same thing. But when students go to a biology classroom, it really does depend on who they have teaching the content. So you can have two classes apparently learning the same thing, but the students walk out thinking completely different things based on how it's presented as to whether a sleight of hand has taken place or not. So I think parents need to look as to see what is going on in their child's classroom.
Is that hard to do?
Well, these days I think it's a lot easier. Most schools have their own portal system online where, parents can go in and see unit outlines. Often schools put even their lesson plans for each class.
Yep.
But I think it's just having those conversations with your children at home. Ask the questions, what did you learn in science today? If they learn about evolution, great, explain it to me and get them to critically think as well about what they've been taught and what they've experienced.
Okay.
So I think, one, parents need to be involved, understand what's happening in their kids' lives at school. But also then, as a follow-on to that, parents also need to be equipped themselves. So parents need to be able to understand what the theory of evolution is, the claims it makes, and maybe the things that don't add up, to be able to talk to their kids.
Otherwise, they could be telling me stuff that's going on and I've got no idea whether it's right or wrong.
Exactly. And I think from a student point of view, and particularly for Christian students, because often there is that debate of, should Christians, really learn a lot about evolution or not? If we don't agree with it, should we ignore it? And my advice has always been, Christian students should know more about evolution than their peers. Because if you're going to refute something, you need to know a lot about it. So educate yourself up as much as you can to understand, again, what is the theory, what are its claims, and what are some of the ways that we say, actually, that doesn't make any sense. And another great way maybe for teachers out there, for educators, is I actually had a senior biology teacher who's retired now, a fantastic teacher, and she would teach the entire senior unit. So this is senior biology now.
Okay.
She would teach the entire unit on the theory of evolution as it was laid out in the syllabus. Wouldn't put her personal opinion at all, just teach the whole unit.
Yep.
And then right at the end, on the last day of class, she would say to the students, right, we're going to go back to year 7 science and we're going to put up the scientific method on the board.
Okay.
And so she would write it out. She'd get them to say, okay, well, scientific method, we pose a question, we design an experiment, we collect data, we analyse it, and we draw conclusions. So she'd write it up on the board and say, okay, we've just spent a whole unit looking at the theory of evolution. Let's go through the scientific method with it.
Put it to the test.
Put it to the test. So number 1, does it make a claim? Is there a question?
Okay.
Yes, the theory of evolution explains diversity of life. Right. Design an experiment. And the kids would go, actually, how do you design an experiment to show something that happened in the past? You can't. And they'd all sit there, and after about 5 minutes of trying to come up with how to grapple with this, the kids would sit there absolutely and go, but hang on, this means it's not scientific. And she wouldn't say a word. And she'd say, well, that's the current theory of evolution, and she'd leave it at that. And if the students would ask them, well, Miss, what do you think about this? And she'd say, well, come see me at lunch and we can talk about it then. And I just thought that was such a great example for an educator who is, legislatively required to teach this, even if she doesn't agree with the theory. But she taught it in such a way those kids understood the theory of evolution, but she created an environment where she actually got the students to think critically.
Wow.
To actually question it themselves.
Not only has she presented the facts and the truth, but she's also in her processes enabling them and supporting them to think critically, to seek truth, to pursue the truth and facts and evidence and the scientific method. That sounds like what should be going on in a science classroom.
That's how you get great scientists.
We do actually have a resource that could support parents in this as well. It's being offered as a free stream, and the link will be in the description below. And it's called Evolution's Achilles Heels. Can you tell us a little bit about this one, Julie?
Yeah, this is a great documentary where 15 PhD scientists got together and filmed this, that they take the 8 claims, largest claims of evolution, and they then set about refuting them. It's a great one where it's pitched for families are able to sit down and watch it and understand it, but it's also something that, university students can engage in as well. Because it's done by chapters. There's one of the first chapters there is on the topic we've talked about today, natural selection. And so it's a great one where you can sit down, watch a chapter, and then you can discuss it, critique it, come up with lots of your own questions and answers. And then maybe next week you can come back to the next one. So a fantastic one for families, university students, anyone that, as you said, wants to get equipped with understanding a topic that maybe they just have that understanding of, I don't think that this works, but they want to have those resources so that they can engage in conversations with people to be able to articulate, actually, this is why I think that the theory of evolution doesn't hold up.
Fantastic. Julie, thank you so much for all you've brought us through today. It's amazing to be able to see what's going on in our classrooms. Again, the resource Evolution's Achilles Heels, it's going to be available for a free stream. The link will be in the description below. Thank you so much.
Thank you.